Thank you to your family for allowing us to join you on your brother's journey home. There is no denying that changes in policing must be made. Out of crisis comes opportunity, and this is an opportunity for all of us to have some tough conversations, to listen, to learn, and to enact meaningful reform that is long overdue. As a profession, we must learn what is being shared with us. That includes being honest about our history. We must acknowledge that law enforcement's past contains institutional racism, injustices, and brutality. We must acknowledge that policing has had a disparate treatment and impact on disenfranchised communities, especially communities of color and poor communities. Several topics have risen to the forefront, and all reforms must be vetted and ensure that they are sustainable, effective, and have no unintended consequences. Several topics have, law enforcement plays an important role. No two calls for service are the same, and in Houston, we respond to an average of 1.2 million calls for service annually. Those calls disproportionately originate from communities of color. If we are going to talk about better policing, we also need to talk about the root causes behind the need for those calls for service. Some think defunding the police is the answer. I'm here to tell you on behalf of our mayor and other mayors across the country and police chiefs across this country and diverse communities that we serve, this is simply not the answer. Defunding the police without addressing the social economic reality faced by poor communities and the disenfranchised and how they are riddled with missteps which would increase the need for police services. History has shown that underfunding the police can have disastrous consequences and hurt those most in need of our services. Appropriate police funding is critical to ensure agencies have resources to invest in technology like body-worn cameras, recruit qualified police officers who are service-minded, and train in implicit bias, train in cultural competency, train in de-escalation, and other critical training. The overwhelming majority of cops are good people. This cannot be lost. They are faithful public servants who put their uniform on every day, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. We can't let, again, the actions of bad cops let us lose sight of the fact that most cops are good. We must all judge each other through the prism and content of our individual hearts and actions, and not through the prism of color and the uniform that we wear. While there is no national use of force standard and previous efforts at establishing one were met with disagreement, several components are ubiquitous throughout the U.S. Prioritization of the sanctity of life, duty to intervene, and the use of de-escalation tactics and techniques is a must. Let me be clear. The actions of the 4 officers involved in the death of Mr. Floyd are inconsistent, unjustified, and repulsive. They are contrary to the protocols of the policing profession, and they sabotage the law enforcement community's tireless efforts to build trust. Moving our profession forward begins with a sustained commitment to accountability. From the start of academy training, recruits must understand that they have an absolute duty to put public safety, service, and security first. In the Houston Police Department, we instill in our men and women the certainty that policy violations regarding truthfulness will lead to termination, or as we put it, if you lie, you die. It is important to note that every chief's administrative authorities are different across the nation, and that not everyone has the legal authority to take immediate action like Chief Arredondo did. I am encouraged that there have been eras in America's history when police have found it difficult to speak up. We are speaking up today. But let it be clear, for many years, officers have consistently been holding one another accountable, and complaints about police misconduct overwhelmingly originate from within agencies, not from members of the community. Communities have an absolute responsibility as well. We ask citizens to report police misconduct without fail. This will afford us the opportunity to investigate, track, and report those complaints. We must also address the issue of officers who have been terminated with cause only to get rehired by another department. Many of us refer to these individuals as gypsy cops. Many gypsy cops have exhibited troubling behavior, and that in turn undermines efforts to build trust with the public and efforts in terms of internal department accountability. Transparency breeds trust, and trust breeds respect. Mutual trust and respect between law enforcement and the public is crucial to good policing. The civil unrest occurring throughout our nation and throughout this entire country is a sobering reminder of how quickly we will lose public trust and the consequences of that fact. Ensuring the department looks more like the communities we serve helps build trust and confidence. Unique perspectives and insights help a department lead and serve the communities of color. I'm happy to report that the Major City Chiefs Association has several departments now that are minority majority, like the City of Houston and the Houston Police Department, and are reflective of the communities that we serve. On behalf of the Major City Chiefs, I want America to know that we hear you. We will continue to do everything in our power to facilitate your right to peacefully protest. The MCCA will not shy away from this challenge and will continue to be a leader and voice in the national discourse and race relations, policing, and reform. To the Floyd family and to the activists across the nation, our commitment is to be your voice, to join you, and to make sure that Mr. Floyd's death was not in vain. I yield the remainder of my time and look forward to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Chief. Our next witness is Ms. Sherilyn Ifill. Ms. Sherilyn Ifill is the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She received her JD from New York University School of Law and her BA from Vassar College. Ms. Ifill, you may begin.
Good morning. My name is Sherilyn Ifill. I'm the President and Director Counsel of NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the nation's oldest civil rights legal organization formed in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan. I want to salute the leadership of Representative Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus on this issue. And I want to extend, on behalf of the Legal Defense Fund, my deepest condolences to the Floyd family and thank them for their courage and their voice at this important moment. We welcome the Justice in Policing Act as a first step in addressing the decades-long call and demand for policing reform. The legislation includes reforms that LDF's Policing Reform Campaign has advocated for years to ensure greater accountability for police officers who engage in misconduct and brutality. Members of Congress incorporated a number of our proposals in the Act, which is a step in the right direction toward ensuring police accountability nationwide. I want to first focus this committee's attention on the significance of this moment and the importance of the federal government's role in addressing this crisis. You are in a civil rights moment. In 1964, 1965, 66, and 67, cities all over the North in this country were gripped by urban unrest. In Watts and Detroit, Harlem, Minneapolis, and scores of other cities, Black people took to the streets to protest police brutality. It was during that period of unrest that Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Riots are the language of the unheard." The 1968 Kerner Commission was created to study the source of that unrest. And much of the report's findings and recommendations focused on law enforcement presence and conduct in Black communities. This period overlapped with the years that most people think of as the core civil rights movement, when Black people in the South petitioned, protested, marched, and demanded federal legislation to address segregation, voter suppression, and economic injustice. The result were core civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But despite the unrest in northern cities, in over 100 cities during that decade, there was no legislation to address the issue of police brutality in African American communities. And as a result, very little has changed since that period as it relates to this issue. Therefore, too many officers know that they can commit the most heinous acts against African Americans without fear of accountability. Ranking Member Jordan said that the killers of George Floyd will face justice. But we also know that those who killed Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Terrence Crutcher, Eleanor Bumpers, Michael Stewart, Clifford Glover, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, and countless others never were held accountable for the crimes they committed. That snapshot of former Officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on the neck of George Floyd with his hands in his pockets, looking out with no fear of being videotaped, should shame every member of this body, every judge, every lawyer, everyone who has participated in the perpetuation of a system that calls itself a justice system, but routinely allows officers of the state to take innocent life with impunity. You have the chance now to change that. One of the key parts of the system of impunity has been qualified immunity, a defense that shields officials from the unforeseeable consequences of their act, but has been interpreted by courts so expansively that it now provides near immunity for police officers who engage in unconstitutional acts of violence. LGF has litigated a number of these cases. For example, in 2018, we filed a petition in the United States Supreme Court appealing a decision of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit that affirmed summary judgment in favor of a law enforcement officer who tased our client, Carrie Illich, 19 times to death. The U.S. Supreme Court denied the petition, and this case was not a one-off. Every year, cert petitions are filed in the court seeking review of cases in which law enforcement officers have successfully eluded accountability for the most violent forms of brutality by raising the qualified immunity defense. The Justice in Policing Act seeks to address qualified immunity by amending the civil rights statute used most in police excessive use of force cases, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, and we welcome this amendment. We want it to apply to all civil suits that are pending or filed after enactment of the Act, and we'll continue to work towards the elimination of qualified immunity. There's bipartisan support for ending qualified immunity, and so I'll close my remarks by quoting from a federal circuit court judge in a decision issued just this week in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. It was written by a judge appointed first to the bench by George W. Bush, and he said in Jones versus City of Martinsburg, Judge Henry Floyd said, Wayne Jones was killed just 1 year before the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of Michael Brown would once again draw national scrutiny to police shootings of black people in the United States. 7 years later, we're asked to decide whether it was clearly established that 5 officers could not shoot a man 22 times as he lay motionless on the ground. Before the ink dried on this opinion, the FBI opened an investigation into the death of yet another black man at the hands of police, this time George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has to stop. To award qualified immunity at the summary judgment stage in this case would signal absolute immunity for fear-based use of force, which we cannot accept. This decision represents a minority of cases, and so we need Congress to act. You are required by history to meet this civil rights moment. It is a moment in which we have a chance to transform our approach to public safety, to recognize that most community conflicts do not require the intervention of an armed officer, and to speak our values through federal and state budgets that prioritize our commitment to anti-discrimination, to public health, and to true public safety for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Darrell Scott, who is the founder and senior pastor of the New Spirit Revival Center, a non-denominational church in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Pastor Scott is also the author of the book, Nothing to Lose: Unlikely Allies in the Struggle for a Better Black America. Pastor Scott, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, members of committee, Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for inviting me to participate in these very serious hearings today. I want to begin by stating that the prospect of defunding and or dismantling police forces across the country is one of the most unwise, irresponsible proposals by American politicians in our nation's history and makes absolutely no sense at all, at least to me. I believe it is nothing short of the politicizing of current social events in an effort to garner votes during this election season. I also believe that it's a reactionary measure that can and will result in short and long-term damage to American society, particularly in our inner city and urban communities. Now, I recognize the fact that the elimination of excessive force and physical retaliation by officers of the law against American citizens is paramount today. I recognize the fact that racial profiling and the harsh treatment of minorities is a very real reality that must be eliminated immediately. I myself can testify of times in my life when I felt racially profiled by police. I can testify of times in my life when I was pulled over for driving while black. I can testify of giving my grandson, who is now of driving age, the talk of how to properly behave if pulled over by police because he had the question of a very real fear of the possibility of death at the hands of police. In fact, my very first interaction with police when I was 13 years old resulted in me being roughed up. I could very easily have been George Floyd. George Floyd could have very easily been me, my brothers, my friends, or any number of any other black men in America. However, I do not recommend throwing the baby out with the bathwater by labeling all police officers as bad cops simply because of the bad actions of a rogue segment of those whose job is supposed to be to protect and to serve American citizens. In fact, in certain inner city communities across America, increased funding for police and increased police presence is actually necessary in order to enforce the law and to guarantee the safety and the security of law-abiding members of those communities. As one who was formerly in that street life years ago, I might be a pastor, but I didn't come down from heaven. I came up out of hell with the rest of everybody else. I was formerly in that street life. I know very much about the criminal element, and I can state definitively that the criminal element in and of society would enjoy nothing better than a reduction in police presence and police power. It would allow those with criminal intentions and criminal actions to flourish virtually unchallenged in the communities of America. The law-abiding members of society would be directly threatened by the absence of police or the inability of police to respond to criminal activities, and in many cases would endeavor to take the law into their own hands to ensure their safety and well-being, as evidenced by the response of some who decided to defend themselves and their property from vandalism. An absence of police presence could potentially give rise to acts of domestic terrorism, mob rule, gang rule, neighborhood intimidation, oppression, and vigilantism. Defunding of police departments has already happened in a number of American cities, and rather than remedying problems, has actually made conditions much worse. The city of Cleveland, my hometown, is a prime example of the results of police defunding. In 2004, the city of Cleveland laid off 285 officers. The entire police budget was slashed by 31%. To cover basic services, the following units were either disbanded or cut forever. The district strike force units, the narcotics unit was completely cut. SWAT was downsized. The fugitive unit was disbanded. The auto theft unit was disbanded. The intelligence unit was cut to bare bones. The mounted unit was cut 85%. The aviation unit was down completely for 3 years and is now only utilized during special events. The harbor unit was disabled. The boat sits rotting in a dry dock. The scientific investigation unit was cut 80%. All the lab techs were let go. All evidence collection is now done by priority. The DARE problem, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, was cut. Community policing was cut 45%. Cleveland went through a decade-long downsizing which saw the department reduced from 1,900 officers to 1,500 officers on average. Zone car coverage, which directly affects citizens, has been cut. Police presence in any given district or in any given shift has been cut in half. 1- and 2-man units have been cut in half. Response time is dramatically longer if the police show up at all. The murder rates have climbed. The property crime is at record levels. Aggravated robbery statistics are higher. Drug sales, drug use, drug abuse is higher. Drug and alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents are the highest they've ever been. Cleveland has went from a relatively safe city per capita to an unbelievably unsafe city. Calls for service have increased even though the population has dropped significantly over the last 20 years. Once safe areas of the city are now unsafe. Once nice neighborhoods in the city are now not nice. Homicides are up 55% in Cleveland from this time last year, and Cleveland now has a higher murder rate per 100,000 residents than Chicago does. I believe that police departments are only as effective as politicians and their appointees allow them to be. Consequently, politicians and appointees are directly responsible for the state of their police departments. Law-abiding citizens, and I've spoken to a great deal of them, overwhelmingly think that defunding or disbanding police departments is a horrible idea. Community policing is a very viable option to address the needs of inner city communities. Having police in the communities to actually get to know the residents is the best way to obtain the results that we all want. When I was growing up, the residents and the business owners knew the police officers that were assigned to our neighborhoods, and their presence was a deterrent to criminal activity. So in short, defunding of police departments in America has already happened, and it is proven to be an epic fail. We cannot allow that paradigm to continue if we want the neighborhoods of America to be safe to live in, the streets of America to be safe for residents to walk on, and the communities of America conducive for businesses to buy in. So I recommend and I agree with the fact that police reform, or better yet, police revision should be enacted. But it has to be one that is sensitive to the stress, tension, pressure, and paranoia that policing produces. The fact that on any given day, any given call, any given stop can result in an officer's death can be very challenging mentally, while also being sensitive to the citizens of America who are supposed to be protected by the police and not be enemies of the police, whether in the suburbs or in the inner cities, whether we're black, white, red, yellow, or brown. I really believe that most police officers, most cops began their careers, most bad cops began their careers as good cops, but they allowed the rigors of their job to affect their perspectives and their social interaction with those they are supposed to protect, and they began perceiving those that they are supposed to protect as those they themselves need to be protected from. I'm in agreement. I endorse police reform, but it has to be sensitive to both sides of that issue. Thank you for allowing me. God bless you.
Thank you. Before I call the next witness, I just remind witnesses to turn off their mics when you're not speaking. Turn them on when you're speaking, turn them off when you're not speaking, please. Our next witness is Mr. Paul Butler. He's the Albert Brick Professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where he specializes in criminal law and race relations. Professor Butler is also the author of the book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice and Chokehold, Policing of Black Men. Mr. Butler received his JD from Harvard Law School and his BA from Yale University. Mr. Butler, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, honorable members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I'm so sorry for your loss. May the memory of your brothers, the memory of the other martyrs, be a blessing to the people all over the country, all over the world, who are rising up in what Martin Luther King called the beautiful struggle for equal justice. There has never, not for 1 minute in American history, been peace between black people and the police. And nothing since slavery has sparked the level of outrage among African Americans as when they feel under violent attack by the police. Black people have endured Jim Crow segregation, being shut out of Social Security and the GI Bill, massive resistance to school desegregation, nonstop efforts to prevent us from voting, and poison water. But the rare times black people have set aside traditional civil rights strategies and instead have risen in the streets, destroyed property, and resisted symbols of the state has been because of something that the police have done. Watts in 65, Newark in 67, Miami 1980, LA 1992, Ferguson 2015, Baltimore 2016, Minneapolis in 2020. All of those cities went up in flames because the police killed another black man. Unlawful violence is never acceptable, either as a misguided approach of a few or as an abuse of the power and trust we place in law enforcement officers. The main problem is not bad apple cops. Officers have difficult jobs and many serve with honor and valor. Still, almost every objective investigation of a police department finds that police, as policy, treat African Americans with contempt. The police kill, wound, pepper spray, beat up, detain, frisk, handcuffs, and use dogs against black people in circumstances in which they do not do the same to white people. When armed agents of the state are harming American citizens in our name, we the people must ask why. In the past 2 weeks, we've seen acts of grace and bravery by police officers. Cops in New York took a knee. In Houston, Chief Acevedo arranged for an honor guard to accompany Mr. Floyd's body when he came home. Unfortunately, we have also witnessed these past 2 weeks police officers commit deplorable acts of violence against the citizens they've sworn to serve and protect. In New York, officers drove 2 large police vehicles into a crowd of protesters. In Atlanta, officers broke the window of a car, dragged out 2 college students, and shot them with a stun gun in Buffalo. A police officer knocked a 75-year-old man to the ground, but what happened next was just as bad. When 2 officers were disciplined for that criminal conduct, 57 other officers quit the squad in protest. President Obama's task force on policing decried the warrior mentality present among too many law enforcement officers. In Buffalo, the nation saw warriors on steroids. African American and Hispanic people disproportionately bear the cost. Blacks are about 20% of the population of Minneapolis, but 60% of the people who cops use violence against. The result is that there are more black people in the criminal legal system today than there were slaves in 1850. When I mentioned to a young man I mentor that if he attended protests, he should wear a mask, he said he certainly would try. But he wanted me to know that as a young black man, he has a greater risk of dying from police violence than from the coronavirus. According to the National Academy of Science, 1 in 1,000 African American men and boys will be killed by the police. What African Americans need to realize equal justice under the law is for selective enforcement and police brutality to end. We need the police to stop killing us, to stop beating us up, to stop arresting us in situations in which they would not do those things to white people. The Justice in Policing Act is a common sense reform. Among other things, it requires cops to be trained on understanding racial bias. In Minneapolis, as 3 officers crushed the life out of Mr. Floyd, and another served as a lookout, somebody in the crowd said to the cops, "He's human, bro." But these 4 officers did not treat Mr. Floyd like a human being. Too often, police work seems to enforce the dehumanization of people of color. Understanding the history and reality of racism in the United States will make our men and women in blue more effective officers. In the end, this hearing is about the legitimacy and sustainability of our democracy. No justice, no peace is not a threat. It is simply a description of how the world works. The multiracial, multi-generational demonstrations that have risen up all over the United States reflect the wonderful diversity of our great nation and the potential of ordinary citizens to make our country live up to its highest ideals. The Justice and Policing Act of 2020 heralds the urgency of transformation and the promise for all Americans of equal justice under the law.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. Our next witness is Benjamin Crump. Benjamin Crump is the founder and principal owner of Ben Crump Law. He is also currently representing George Floyd's family. Mr. Crump received his JD and BA from Florida State University. Mr. Crump, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and distinguished members of the committee. I know all the speakers have 5 minutes to speak, but I wish it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds, not as a symbolic gesture, but as an actual exact time reference of how long George Floyd literally begged. He literally narrated a documentary of his death, begging for his life, saying, "I can't breathe," and calling for his mama. The death of George Floyd has galvanized the world and mobilized Americans to demand a more just system of policing, because it's become painfully obvious that what we have right now are two systems of justice, one for white Americans and another for black Americans. George is one in a long line of black Americans who unjustly are killed at the hands of police, or in George's case, at the knee of the police, including Breonna Taylor, Pamela Turner, Botham Jean, Michael Brown, Stephon Clark, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Laquan McDonald, just to name a few. And the list goes on and on. But it is important, Mr. Chairman, that we remember their names. It's way past time that we revise the role of police to become peacekeepers and community partners. Of course, they must be prepared to protect themselves and the public in direct, life-threatening situations. But these should be the exception and not the rule. What we are witnessing throughout our country is not that. Americans are being tear gassed in the streets, hit with rubber bullets, shoved violently to the ground, cracking their skulls against the pavement, beaten bloody with batons. And for what? For demanding justice for black Americans. Our constitutional rights are under attack, and not in the shadows, but in the broad daylight. Changing the behavior of police and their relationships with people of color starts at the top. We need a national standard for policing behavior built on transparency and accountability. The only reason we know what happened to George Floyd is because it was captured on video. The advent of video evidence is bringing into the light what long was hidden. It's revealing what black Americans have known for a long, long time, that it is dangerous for a black person to have an encounter with a police officer. Given the incidents that have led to this moment in time, it should be mandatory for police officers to wear body cams and should be considered obstruction of justice to turn them off. Like a black box data recorder in an airplane, body cams replace competing narratives with a single narrative, the truth, with what we see with our own eyes. Second, insist that police officers only use the level of force needed based on the level of threat actually posed by the circumstances. We've seen way too many black people shot in the back, or unarmed black people shot and killed, or a handcuffed black man face down on the pavement, asphyxiated by a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, though he posed no threat at all. Neck restraints were used by Minnesota police more than 200 times, resulting in suspects losing consciousness at least 44 times. Lethal restraints like chokeholds and strangleholds should be outlawed. Finally, reform how qualified immunity applies to police officers. If officers know they have immunity, they act with impunity. If officers know they can unjustly take the life of a black person with no accountability, they will continue to do so. That's what you saw in the eyes of Derek Chauvin when, with his hand casually tucked in his pocket as he extinguished the life of George Floyd. Accountability requires that officers face public consequences for unjustly taking a life or brutalizing a fellow American that are sworn, they are sworn to protect and serve. Too often, many officers are silent in the face of evil because of the blue shield, the brotherhood of police officers, which fosters systematic racism and abuse. But there's a higher brotherhood that God calls us to honor, the brotherhood of mankind, black and white. That's what we're witnessing in the diversity of the protesters filling our streets, even today. And that's the brotherhood our police officers must honor above all. The Founding Fathers knew they had not built the infallible system, a faultless union, but they did task us with the perpetual duty to aim for it, a more perfect union of justice, liberty, resilience, hope, and compassion. We have to do better, and we must strive to live up to those American ideals. We are better than this. Chairman, members of the committee, you have the power to make this moment in history the tipping point. So many of us have been waiting for, fighting for, and praying for, that Americans are marching for. You have the power to make sure that George Floyd's death is not in vain. I've been asking for us to take a breath. Number one, the breath that George Floyd was denied. Secondly, take a breath to consider how we use police in our society and how we hold them accountable for the tremendous
Reopening sale at Sleep Express.
Welcome back, everyone. Well, right now on First Alert Live Doppler radar, we see some rain making its way into extreme southwestern.
And when I come home from work to my own home, in between I drive a nice car that I worked hard for and people in my community think I stole it. I often see police officers pull up behind me and run my license plate and then drive off because they know I don't have any warrants. What was shocking about that statement was that was a police captain of one of our biggest law enforcement agencies in the Bay Area. If he doesn't feel safe as a police captain, how can people who don't have the resources that he has feel safe? But I want to talk about something else that you mentioned, Mr. Floyd, because we're here because individual tragedies and institutional tragedies continue to persist. And unless we do something now, they'll continue. You talked about the officers there not listening to your brother. On January 1, 2009, in Oakland, California, unarmed Oscar Grant laid on his stomach as an officer shot him in the back. And his last words before he died were, "You shot me. I have a 4-year-old daughter." On July 2014, Eric Gardner in a chokehold in Staten Island, gasping to say, "I can't breathe," before he died. No one on the scene heard him. And your brother, Mr. Floyd, on May 25, a police officer with his knee on his neck, as your brother said, "I can't breathe. I want my mama. I can't breathe." And the officers on that scene did not hear your brother. Because of this tragedy, the world is listening now. What do you want them to hear?
want them to stop hiring corrupted police officers. I know it's no way to figure out who's good and who's bad, but we got to find a way, because your heart has to be big if you're an officer. You just can't use the badge to be able to do what you want to do when you want to do it. You're supposed to serve and you're supposed to protect. I didn't see anybody protecting and serving that day when my brother was on his front, on his chest, hands behind his back. Please, 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 I can't breathe. A grown man, 46 years of age, crying for his mom. Just hurt, just looking all the time. People try to show it to you, figuring it out. They lynched my brother. That was a modern day lynching in broad daylight. People was out there pleading, please, please, get off, he can't breathe, he can't breathe. People were video recording it. Nobody cared. Nobody. My brother, he lost his life before 8 minutes and 46 seconds. He went unconscious. His life was gone. They just dragged his body across that concrete, his lifeless body. Every day, I'm gonna have to live with that. My family's gonna have to live with that. His kids are gonna have to live with that. I just don't know. Right now, I'm happy that we are getting one step closer to justice, but for the time being, I still need time to grieve with my family, because I haven't had that chance yet.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Rushenthaler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you to all the witnesses who came here to testify today. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs. It takes an incredible amount of courage to come here and talk about this after losing a loved one. So I know I speak for all my colleagues when I thank you for your willingness to come here and share your stories with this committee. And as Leader McCarthy said earlier today, George and Patrick will not be forgotten. Everyone in this room agrees that police officers who abuse their power must be held accountable for their crimes. But I hope that we can also agree that the vast majority of law enforcement officers choose their line of work because they want to protect their communities. They put themselves in harm's way every single day, and they do it to keep us in America safe. In southwestern Pennsylvania, we've seen firsthand how the selflessness of the police actually saves lives. In 2018, 11 Jewish worshipers were killed by a hateful anti-Semitic madman at the Tree of Life synagogue. The Pittsburgh police and police from around the region ran into open gunfire, and if it were not for their heroic efforts, the tragic loss of life could have been much worse. So that's why I'm incredibly alarmed to hear calls from the left to defund our nation's police departments. And those on the left can try to minimize this, but I just heard my colleague from Arizona go through a litany of statements from those on the left that are calling for defunding and dismantling police departments. I think that if anything, the murder of George Floyd demonstrates the need to invest more in our police departments. We should focus on improving training to promote good police practices. We should also be providing mental health care, especially for those that are struggling with PTSD and other job-related stresses. Additionally, we should work to build stronger bonds between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We can start by having school resource officers in our schools. But I recognize, we must recognize and we must empower good police officers while terminating bad actors. With that said, Mr. Bongino, do you think that defunding our nation's police departments is an effective way of addressing instances of police misconduct?
No, it's a disastrous policy. And I think one of the issues that hasn't been considered are the second order effects. I mean, obviously the first order effects are quite obvious. Less police on the streets means more crime. There's simply no deterrent to crime unless you trust in the goodness of every man's heart, which would be a potentially disastrous, you are going to have more crime. But think about the second order effects. Has anyone on the panel considered the brain drain that would happen? You will have child abuse investigators who have a very unique ability. They've accumulated over time to look a child in the eye and know right away when they're trying to protect an abuse of a parent because they've been threatened. I've seen it. What about child sexual abuse online, where some of these people, they can look at an image and tell 6 different degrees of separation, how that person got there and who that abused child is? You're going to defund them too? What about the latent print officer that shows up at your house for a burglary that's been taking fingerprints for 20 years? You're going to teach someone that in 5 minutes in a social worker, police academy? Again, God bless our social workers. That's not what they do. What about the homicide detectives I worked with? When I was a young rookie Secret Service agent, I couldn't break a guy on an interrogation. I couldn't get him to admit the crime. He didn't want to admit it. We had a guy walk in, he walked in, knew how to interview. Within 5 minutes, we had a full confession, admitted to everything, because he'd done it before. And he knew exactly the back and forth of interview and interrogation. These are skills that are going to be missing from our streets. You don't understand the catastrophe that would follow. And I can't emphasize in strong enough terms a disaster this would be if anyone follows through on it.
Thank you, Mr. Bongino. And I want to talk about the effect this would have on the communities that are most vulnerable. For example, affluent communities, if the police forces were dismantled and defunded, those affluent communities would just hire private police firms. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence that's already happened in some places. But could you talk about the effect, the sad irony we would see if this happened and what it would have on the most vulnerable communities?
Now, think about it. With the 7-5 precinct in East New York, Brooklyn, where I worked, a couple of years before I got there, they had more homicides in that one precinct in New York City than the entire city of Baltimore had a few years ago. By the time I got there in the 90s, they had cut that down to such a point that the entire crime rate in New York City was almost equivalent to that of Baltimore City, a city multiple times the size. This will save real lives if we increase our police, not decrease our police budgets. That's insane.
Thank you, and I yield.
I now recognize Mr. Liu for his questions for 5 minutes.
I want to thank Chairman Nadler and Subcommittee Chair Bass for your excellent leadership on this outstanding legislation. We're here because Black Lives Matter. And most Republican officials have been unable to say those 3 words. The President has been unable to say it. The Attorney General hasn't said it. And the overwhelming majority of Republican senators and House members have not said it. Why does this matter? Because you can't fix the problem if you can't even identify the problem. This is not a problem of a few bad apples. This is systematic institutional racism against Black Americans. Our life is precious. Black lives are subjected to much higher risk of brutality from the police than white lives. That's what the data shows. We know, for example, that Black Americans are killed at a rate twice as high from police than white Americans. Our government murdered George Floyd and countless Black Americans. And it wasn't one rogue cop who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. There were an additional 2 police officers who had their knees on George Floyd's body. And then a 4th officer who stood as a lookout. And then a Minneapolis Police Department spokesperson who gave a completely misleading initial account of what happened. And then there were the officers and civilians at the department who knew about the 18 misconduct claims against Derek Chauvin and didn't take strong enough action. It takes a village to allow for the persistent, systematic murder of Black Americans by our government, and this has got to stop. The Justice and Policing Act takes a critical step to stopping the state-sanctioned police brutality against Black Americans. It has a lot of great provisions. First one I'd like to focus on is training. Now, is training going to stop bad cops from doing bad things? No. But it might help good cops from doing bad things. I note for the record that in terms of training hours, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, police recruits spend on average 840 hours in basic training and 500 hours in field training for a total of 1,340 hours. In California, to be a licensed cosmetologist requires 1,600 hours. So in other words, it takes more training hours to be a hairdresser than to be a police officer. Now, just as important as the number of hours is how we train our officers. I'm very pleased that this legislation requires training in racial bias, in racial profiling, and in procedural justice. My first question today is to Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, when you testified before this committee last September, you talked about procedural justice. Can you explain what procedural justice training is and why it's so important?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I can. The basic concept of procedural justice is the evidence that shows people comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police or even going into custody. They comply with the law because they're giving a voice. They believe the law is fair and equitably applied, and that the process will be fair to them. We know this over the years when people get tickets and we survey them. How they're treated determines their view about that process more than whether or not they got the ticket. So this idea of procedural justice is a way to obtain compliance, how to get people to but to comply, and it should be trained so that officers know how to gain compliance, how to give people a voice, how to recognize how they treat people has a greater impact on how they respond to that authority than anything else.
Thank you very much. My second question is to Ms. Ifill. Recently, Attorney General Bill Barr stated that he didn't think there was systematic racism in law enforcement systems. Do you agree with him that this is just an issue of a few rogue cops rather than the systems we currently have in place?
Not only do I disagree with him, but if Attorney General Barr would consult the reports issued in his own department in pattern and practice investigations in over 24 jurisdictions throughout the country, he would learn that systemic racism actually exists in police departments around the country that has been fully investigated and found by the Department of Justice, who sued those jurisdictions and put them under consent decree. The bad apple theory of policing reform is a failure. It looks only at individual officers instead of the system in which they operate. And if we want to change culture, if we want to change relationships, then you have to change the rules that govern that system. There's no change that happened in this country, especially culture change, that happened because of midnight basketball or that happened because we all got in a room and ate together. We didn't end racial discrimination and segregation in schools by all getting together and having a meeting. It actually required law to make it happen. We didn't end the barring of women from being hired in certain professions by having a conference. It required the law. And now we have found a systemic problem that has been with us for decades that requires law to actually change the context in which policing happens in this country, and to give us a chance to make and to look at public safety more broadly than we've done in the past, and to make police officers accountable within that system of public safety.
Thank you very much. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize Mr. Klein for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Across the street from the Capitol, above the Supreme Court, is inscribed "Equal Justice Under Law." Today I stand with my fellow Americans in condemning the brutal killing of George Floyd and so many others who have been denied that equal justice under the law. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we grieve with you and we mourn with you. You have our sincere condolences for your loss. Mr. Floyd's killing was an outrageous act of violence committed by a member of law enforcement with a long record of over a dozen citizen complaints. With the recent arrests of the former officers involved, I look forward to justice being served, and being served quickly. But for so many others, they will not see that justice served. In the time that has passed since Mr. Floyd's murder, many more examples of injustice across the nation have had the spotlight shone upon them, including Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was killed by officers in her apartment when a no-knock warrant was served at her residence by officers looking for suspects. American justice should be served in a court of law, but sadly, many have been denied this right, having been killed while being brought into custody. Mr. Chairman, in my district office, I have a copy of one of Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, the freedom of speech. One of the freedoms given to us by our Creator and a cornerstone of American democracy. As we mourn the death of George Floyd, we're also witnessing Americans who continue to exercise their First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble, protest Mr. Floyd's death, and highlight other instances of police violence across the country and the need for significant real reform. Congress should continue to work together to find solutions to these pervasive problems and ensure that all Americans are being afforded access to equal justice under the law. I believe there are many ways we can continue to work together rather than put forward policies that divide us. This committee has a long history of working together to find bipartisan solutions on issues facing our justice system. The First Step Act, just 2 years ago, reformed our federal criminal justice system. This act included provisions focused on reducing recidivism, reforming incarceration policy, correctional reforms, sentencing reforms, and improved oversight. Many of the policies included in Chairwoman Bass's bill are ideas that can achieve that bipartisan consensus once again. Increased data collection about officer-involved shootings, body cameras, outlawing chokeholds, making lynching a federal crime, demilitarizing our police forces are all areas where we can potentially find that bipartisan consensus. Although we may need to review certain tactics and methods used by law enforcement, we cannot continue to consider the irrational and ridiculous notion of defunding, disbanding, or eliminating our police departments. The rule of law is foundational in the United States, and we must advance solutions that provide fair access to justice while enforcing our laws. As John Adams said, we are a nation of laws, not of men. The vast majority of those who serve and protect are good people and stand firmly against the violent and hateful actions of bad officers. At the same time, we cannot ignore the need to have dialogue and understanding when confronting difficult issues like the ones before us today. We must also look at the departmental policies that are keeping bad officers in their positions. A substantial number of collective bargaining agreements among police departments limit officer interrogations after alleged misconduct, mandate the destruction of disciplinary records, ban civilian oversight, prevent anonymous civilian complaints, indemnify officers in the event of civil suits, and limit the length of internal investigations. Instead of efforts pursued by the majority to expand police unions, we should be limiting the scope of their collective bargaining and ensure that laws already on the books aren't hampered by contracts that they've negotiated, such as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, whose effectiveness has been diluted because DOJ's attempt to reform police departments must work around the terms of collective bargaining agreements. Mr. Floyd, you just said we might not be able to tell the good cops from the bad, but we should be able to keep the bad ones from coming back. This is a time for personal and national reflection on how we can be better neighbors and better citizens of the greatest nation on earth. I truly hope we can seize this moment in time so that Americans can come together, and I hope as legislators we can come together to craft solutions to make our community safe, strengthen the bonds that unite us, and ensure that we can live out God's direction in Micah 6, chapter 6, verse 8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Floyd, I have a brother too, whom I love very much, and I cannot imagine your pain right now. My heart goes out to you, and I want to just say you've been a wonderful brother to your brother and a great citizen today. So thank you for sticking with us. Professor Butler, the whole point of the social contract is that we'll be safer inside of it rather than outside of it in a state of nature or state of war. That's why our Constitution protects life, liberty, and property against arbitrary deprivation by the government. Now, this legislation that we're looking at today, the Justice and Policing Act, will ban chokeholds, strangleholds, no-knock warrants, racial and ethnic profiling. It'll criminalize lynching. It will end the militarization of local police departments. It creates a national police misconduct registry. It strengthens the standards of police accountability. My question for you is, given that you're someone who studies this for a living and teaches about it, is the social contract working for African Americans today with respect to policing? And if not, will this legislation actually vindicate the value of human life that members on both sides of the aisle have spoken about?
Indeed, Congressman, I was so moved by Mr. Johnson's introduction but he talked about the dignity of every human life. And then we heard Ranking Member Jordan echo Mr. Floyd's heartfelt plea that life is precious. The Justice Act of 2020 reaffirms the sanctity of life. It establishes national standards for when the police can legally kill people and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques. The act states that cops can only kill people as a last resort and requires them to try to de-escalate the situation before resorting to deadly force. This is common sense, but it's not the law now.
Thank you. Ms. Gupta, do you agree with Mr. Crump that we should impose the traditional doctrine of respondeat superior, let the master answer for the employee on police departments so that they have the proper incentives to carefully train and supervise and monitor their officers?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Eiffel, Mayor Morial spoke of the history of lynching and racism and the cycles of American history, and there have been two other moments in our history when America moved aggressively to try to transcend the original curse of violent white supremacy. One was Reconstruction, which lasted 12 years after the Civil War before it was undone by racism. And the second was the modern civil rights movement, the so-called Second Reconstruction, when the blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman and Medgar Evers and Bob Moses and our colleague John Lewis and many others gave us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this civil rights movement, this Second Reconstruction, also faced a violent backlash. What are our prospects for a third and enduring Reconstruction today, Ms. Eiffel? What needs to happen for us to transcend the nightmare of racist violence and injustice that we seem to have been trapped in?
Well, thank you. Well, for purposes of this hearing, every member of this body has to take responsibility for what is happening in this country and decide that they will put behind them their election prospects, their sound bites for Fox News, or for any other news network. They have to decide that they want to get their hands around this problem. And that means working together to try and solve what the people in cities in every state in this country have told them over the last 2 weeks is a problem that people will not tolerate anymore. It takes courage. It is going to take a lot of work for all of you in that body to come together. But this bill has provisions that I believe you can agree on from what I've heard today. And I would encourage people to read the bill. This bill does not repeal qualified immunity, for example. It actually changes the standard that courts have distorted over time. Read the bill. There is nothing in this bill that should be objectionable to anyone who cares about public safety truly, who cares about anti-discrimination and pledges themselves to it, who cares about the rule of law, and who cares about this country, and who believes, as many have said today, that they owe something to Mr. Floyd and his family, and even to Ms. Jacobs and her family, because police officers are made unsafe by the current system.
Thank you.
I would encourage people to read the bill, and I would encourage people to step up with courage, not only in this body, but in state and local governments as well, and to decide that they want to work together to solve this problem that the people have said cannot wait anymore.
Thank you, Ms. Eiffel. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request that I would like to propose, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
A number of our colleagues have denounced several episodes of violence that have marred the beautiful and massive nonviolent protests that are transforming America today, and I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following articles: white supremacists and other extremists exploiting this moment in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, far-right infiltrators and agitators in George Floyd protests, indicators of white supremacists, unjust security, and Facebook removes nearly 200 accounts tied to hate groups encouraging members to attend protests over police killings. And that is in ABC News.
Without objection, and the gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd, I would offer my personal condolence to you in the loss of your brother. I can't imagine having to watch your family member die needless and merciless passing. And I feel confident that not only justice will be served for him, but I think that significant and necessary reforms will come of this tragic incident. And I wish Miss Underwood Jacobs was still here, but I also want to give my condolences to her. Hopefully she'll watch the video. I have a brother and a father in law enforcement. I cannot imagine the pain that you are experiencing knowing that someone intentionally targeted him simply because he was an officer. I'm very sorry for your loss, and my prayers are with you and your family and with Mr. Floyd's family. In my prayers this morning, Philippians 4:13 came to mind. So I hope that you all can reflect on that. This is a dangerous, dangerous time for law enforcement and their families. Just in the conversation I had with my brother yesterday, he said he had 2 of his deputies quit because all of the issues that they're facing, threats, targeting, being reconned on their homes, their vehicles being looted and broken into at their homes. And speaking of law enforcement officers, I also like to give condolences to the family of the retired police captain, David Dorn, who was fatally shot last week trying to prevent a pawn shop from being looted during what the left is calling a peaceful protest. His life mattered as well, and I commend his service to his community as a law enforcement officer and wish that there was a member of his family here represented today to give their remarks in his passing. While officers like David Dorn and David Underwood have been targeted and murdered during these so-called protests, it is extremely troubling that many of my colleagues on the left have failed to condemn the violence and rioting in our cities and communities across the country. Protests are peaceful. Looting, killing, stealing, destruction, and burning some of the very cities where their leaders just weeks ago were arresting people for violating stay-at-home orders is absolute lawlessness. And the hypocrisy of these leaders arresting those violating stay-at-home orders for, say, going surfing or other activities, gathering in a synagogue with 10 or more people. The hypocrisy of these leaders arresting those individuals for violating stay-at-home orders, but sitting by while their cities burn is outlandish to me. On one day alone, on May 31st in Chicago, one city, on one day, saw 18 people murdered due to rioting in one night. The deadliest day in Chicago in 60 years. There were over 65,000 911 calls. And can you imagine if we abolished the police department, those 65,000 people would be calling and nobody would be there to come to the rescue. That is not America. That is anarchy. And when your leaders talk about disbanding police departments, you are emboldening criminals to continue to commit crime, knowing that there will be no one to stop them. I talked to my brother yesterday, and they had an incident at a Walmart where there were 30 individuals looting the Walmart that my wife and I go to on a pretty regular basis. And they only had 3 officers respond to 30 individuals who had weapons. Well, they're not going to use 3 officers to respond to 30 individuals because of the safety risk incurred to those officers. Those 30 individuals got away. I thought that Pastor Scott had a great statement today in his opening comment. Pastor, you said the prospect of defunding or dismantling our police forces is one of the most unwise, irresponsible proposals made by American politicians. And I would agree. There are issues in this proposal that we can all agree upon. A law against lynching, which I supported in this House passed months ago, which we voted for earlier this year. Ensuring bad cops don't get rehired at different agencies. Absolutely, that's an incredible idea. Reporting use of force in an FBI database, and creating a commission on social status of black men and boys based on a Florida program that I participated in as a Florida senator in the state of Florida. And I was proud to be a part of that program. But there are proposals in this bill that are extremely dangerous for those who protect our communities. Removing qualified immunity is only a protection if officers follow their training and protocols. If they don't follow the training and protocols, they don't get to use the immunity because it's qualified. If officers don't have qualified immunity to follow their training and protocols, I don't know a single person who would want to become a law enforcement officer in today's world, knowing that they may or may not be able to use the training and protocols that they were used to be able to apprehend a suspect who is not complying with them. But maybe that's the goal of the majority, to get less and less people to join our law enforcement offices. One quick point in the little time I have left is military equipment, or as Mr. Raskin calls it, the militarization of our police departments. They use bulletproof vests and bulletproof shields to protect our officers who protect our communities. By stripping them of that ability and stripping them of their ability to use weapons to protect themselves is a dangerous, dangerous path to go down. And I don't think that our country supports that. And Mr. Floyd, I think, said it best. You said, life is precious. And I would agree with you. And I would contend that all life is precious and all deserves protection. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to mention our subcommittee chair and thank Chairwoman Bass for her leadership. Thank you to all of the witnesses and for your endurance. It's worth it. Mr. Floyd, my family and I, along with my constituents in Florida, join you in grieving the death of your brother, George. I know that Ms. Underwood Jacobs is not here any longer, but my family and I and my constituents also join her in the death of her brother, Patrick. I have attended many law enforcement funerals, more than I care to admit, and we are outraged about both deaths. But let me say this. As law enforcement officers, we are held, they're held to a higher standard. I'm sure Ms. Underwood Jacobs' brother deserved to wear the uniform. Everybody does not. And that's why we are here today. I come before you as the mother of 3 beautiful black sons. I also come before you as a former social worker and a former police chief. Many have tried to frame this tragic event as an us versus them situation. That's not what this is. This is not about the community being against the police or the police being about the community. It's much bigger than that. This moment is about what's right, and this moment is about what's wrong. This is not a black issue or a white issue. It's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is an American issue that has turned into yet another American tragedy. We all have to get this right. Lord knows I want to get this right. While the actions of one brutally murdered took the life of your brother, Mr. Floyd, 3 other officers did nothing about it for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. I have been on the street, and I know what it feels like to be waiting for backup to come. 8 minutes and 46 seconds feels like a lifetime. That's a long time. And while one officer took the life of Mr. Floyd, 3 others stood by and did nothing for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Chief Davis, would you talk for just a moment about an officer's duty to act? In general, an officer's duty to act. For example, if they received a call for service, does an officer have the ability to simply refuse to go to that call? And certainly when they see a crime in progress, a wrongdoing being perpetrated by a fellow officer, please talk about their obligation to intervene and also report to the agency that bad behavior. Chief Davis.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I agree with you 100%. That is why one of the things I asked for earlier was the reaffirmation of the oath of office, because the officer takes the oath to the Constitution to protect and serve, and they have a duty to serve. And we say against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They have the duty to take the calls that they're sent to. They have the duties to enforce the law, and most policies require the duty to intervene. And so they were morally obligated, they were procedurally obligated, they were legally obligated to intervene with Mr. Floyd's murder. They're legally obligated to respond to the calls. We expect them to go to active shooters. We expect them to go to bank robberies, domestic violence, and we also expect them to be consistent. And so anyone that's violating the law should be held accountable, and is not a pass because you wear the badge. So as you know, as a chief, as I just spent 9 years as a chief, it should be held to a much higher standard, and that standard includes the duty to report misconduct, the duty to render first aid, because those are the high standards of this profession.
Thank you so much, Chief Davis, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure that a at-large representative from a state that is 89% white and 100% rural is always the best person to address these issues, and I don't pretend to be. But we neighbor Minnesota. Minneapolis is a city that is far and away the closest to North Dakotans' hearts. And on May 25th, we watched in abject horror as your brother was brutally murdered. And on May 27th, our entire state mourned because Officer Cody Holte was killed trying to save another officer who had been wounded, independent of anything else that is going on in the rest of the country. And the very next Tuesday, we buried Officer Cody Holte, and it was an incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic funeral. Yesterday, I watched your brother's funeral, and it was incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic. But you know what I found through the whole course of all of this? None of it was binary. I agree with Congresswoman Demings. This is not enough us against them. This is not that situation. We can do reform. We've done it before. We've done it in states like North Dakota. And I hope when we go through a markup that we are willing to work through this, because I think you'll find there are a lot of people on my side of the aisle that agree with a lot of the concepts on the other side of the aisle. But I will view this bill the same way I view every other bill. How does it work at 2:30 on the side of the road in a state where it's often one officer, and by the way, not just for the officer and the person being detained. But how does it work at 2:30 on the side of a road where backup is measured in hours and not minutes? Because my concern with these things is always, I don't pretend to know how to police in urban districts. I don't live in an urban district. But you have to recognize that as we intend to do these things, we have a high turnover rate. We have a hard time hiring law enforcement as it is in North Dakota. We have to make sure that it can work everywhere. But if it comes to holding bad cops accountable and bad departments accountable, I'm all in. Because once they wash out everywhere else, they might end up where I'm at. And we don't want that either. But after that, I think I would go with, I hope I can give some people some hope. Because regardless of how this works next week, and regardless of what we mark up, what we move forward, we shouldn't be done. We should continue to work towards other things. And those things are disparities in sentencing, disparities in pretrial release, things that we quantifiably can show exist. In 2016, and this is primarily in state court because it's about 88% of the prison population in the United States is in state court. Black prisoners serve essentially a 5-to-1 prison sentence on drug crimes than white prisoners. Now that's down from 16-to-1 in 2000, but it's pretty hard to pat yourself on the back for something that shouldn't exist in the first place. And what we found is that as we move forward, and we dealt with minimum mandatory sentencing, and minimum mandatory sentencing was supposed to be to get rid of disparity in these sentences. But what we found is blacks are almost twice as likely to be charged with a minimum mandatory offense as white. So instead of taking it out of the court's hands and the judge's hands, we've moved it into prosecutors' hands. Pretrial release, as we continue to do this, states have done this. North Dakota has done this. Working towards issues that allow for people to be released based on risk assessment, not monetary value. Those types of things work. And this matters on the street because you know if you're going to get arrested that you're not going to get out. The likelihood of you resisting, absconding, all of those different things goes up significantly. And we can do that. We should look at policies that are racially neutral on their face, but have a historically disparate racial impact. School zone enhancement for drug crimes. As we've seen this go on years after years, these enhancements have gotten larger and larger, and they also tend to be in highly urban, densely populated, poor neighborhoods that are predominantly African American. Those enhancements need reform. We need to look at those things. And those are things we can continue to do, and I will continue to do with everybody on the other side of the aisle. And my point to this is not to deflect. We've heard all of these different things today. But I want my friends on the other side of the aisle to know that we can do this. And I know we can do it because we did it in North Dakota. And if we can do it in North Dakota, we can do it absolutely anywhere. But it takes working with each other, and it takes working with each other on both sides of the aisle. So no matter how we move forward on this and continue to work, I want you all to know there are people on our side of the aisle that are committed to working on these issues that will have real positive impact for people all across this country. And it's not just about what we have going on now, it's how we continue to work in the future. So reach out, ask us, we're here to help. Thank you all.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Chairwoman Bass, for holding this most important hearing. And Mr. Floyd, I want to thank you for being here today in this very difficult moment for you and your family. The murder of your brother, George Floyd, reminds us all that the relationship between public safety and those who they are sworn to protect can't be assumed to always be one that's a healthy relationship. In my district, the new Ellis Island of the United States, we're diverse and we're always changing. New Americans live side by side with the greatest generation. We have to remember that we are not a police state and we are not a police country, and that for public safety officers to do their job, trust and cooperation are essential. We've worked really hard over decades, the last few decades, to bring that trust into being. And that's why it is so sad to see again another murder, another tragedy in our streets. And this is exactly why this bill has to become law. When I was a California legislator, this issue kept popping up over and over again. In my work with the autism community, this issue again resurfaced about a decade ago. As police began to confront the tidal wave of maturing autistic children, we soon realized that police officers were not trained to deal with autistic adults. Autistic individuals not capable of following directions were considered to be uncooperative, and soon violent conflicts arose and were reported in the press. My work in this area in updating California police officer standards was soon brought to the attention of a retired police chief in the Midwest, the father of an autistic adult who was also trying to address the issue of autism in public safety. This clearly shows that police training is not a local issue, but a national issue. And again, this shows why this bill must become law. The Justice Policing Act of 2020 improves police training and practices by creating law enforcement development programs to develop policies, best practices, among others. In my legislation, H.R. 5251, Improving Community Safety Task Force, directs the Attorney General to also establish a task force seeking ways to reduce violent clashes between communities and public safety officers. And Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Brian Marvel, President of the Peace Officers Research Association of California, discussing how they support reforms.
Without objection.
And Mayor Underwood, I want to let you know that your family's loss, your brother, will also not go forgotten. I have a question for Professor Butler. Welcome, first of all, sir, and welcome to all the witnesses.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to take a moment to discuss arrest disparities. The ACLU has said African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. For Washington, D.C., you have stated that African Americans are about 50% of those that use cannabis, yet they account for 90% of the people who are charged with marijuana crimes. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
How do you think the legalization of cannabis will help with social justice in this nation?
We think it would help create equal justice under the law. We know that for drug crimes, African Americans don't disproportionately commit those crimes. National Institute of Health says that we don't disproportionately possess drugs. Most people report buying drugs from someone of their own race. If you go from NIH and Bethesda to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in DC, they'll tell you 60% people locked up for drug crimes are black. About 15% of people who do the crime 60% for people who do the time. That's unequal justice under the law.
So would you say that we're mixing criminal justice with social issues, with medical issues when it comes to our national drug policy?
The drug addiction issue is an issue of public health, as is the issue of the epidemic of violence in communities. It's a public health issue, not exclusively a criminal law issue.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. First, of course, I want to join my colleagues in expressing our condolences to your family, Mr. Floyd. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of having to relive that video over and over again. I just want to thank you for having the strength to speak here today, to share George's story and his spirits and his words with this committee, but also with the country. And I'm sure that your brother would be proud of you. Our hearts and those of every thinking and feeling American are with you and your family, and we're committed to making the changes that we need to ensure that you, your family, and every family in this country receives the equal justice and the security that our Constitution and our most essential American values demand. We're here to listen and to confront the harsh truths about racism in our country and the law enforcement practices that for too long have allowed police violence against communities of color and especially Black individuals. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and on, have once again brought these truths to the surface, that centuries of systemic racism and inaction have resulted in a justice system that harms Black communities and policing practices that disproportionately kill Black Americans. This is unacceptable. We must change. America must change. And Americans have taken to the streets in peaceful protest all across this great nation, in big cities and small towns, to demand that change. We are witnessing a long overdue moral reckoning in our country, and each of us must examine how to be agents of that change, because we have a lot of work to do. Change must come at the local, state, and federal level, just as cities and states are reckoning with ways to protect communities and hold law enforcement accountable. Congress must do the same. I want to thank all our witnesses for helping us understand the changes we need to make to achieve justice for all Americans, particularly which ones are uniquely crying out for federal solutions. Having worked for decades as a public interest lawyer, I'm particularly interested in some of the legal fixes that this bill provides. I know that sometimes small changes in a statute can have enormous implications for holding powerful institutions accountable, and the bill we're considering contains a few of those. Ms. Gupta, one of the ways that police officers can be held accountable is a federal law that makes it a crime to violate someone's civil rights, including by using excessive force as a police officer. But in its current form, it's very difficult to get a conviction under that law because it requires proving that the police officer willfully violated a person's civil rights. Can you explain how changing the statute to require a reckless standard instead of willfulness would improve police accountability?
Yeah, so the Justice Department currently only has one law that they can use to prosecute police misconduct. And as you said, it has the highest mens rea requirement there is in criminal law, requiring not only that prosecutors prove that the officer used unreasonable force, but actually also that the officer knew that what he or she was doing was in violation of the law and did it anyway. That is actually a very high burden. And so for years, there have been case after case that the Justice Department has been unable to reach because of how high this burden is. There are many criminal civil rights prosecutors that for years have also wanted the change that is being proposed in the Justice and Policing Act, because I think it would enhance the Justice Department's credibility in these matters to be able to hold officers who violate federal civil rights laws accountable. And so the Justice and Policing Act asks it change the mens rea standard to knowingly or with reckless disregard. It's a slightly lower standard, so more cases will be charged. It also really importantly broadens the language of the federal civil rights statute by including in its definition of a death resulting from an officer's action any act that was a substantial factor contributing to death. And I know many former U.S. attorneys that are eager to see this change as well.
I actually was approached by one of those former U.S. attorneys at my train station this week saying this was probably one of the key provisions. It looks like the time has expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. I thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long day, but certainly the topic is worthy of that time and probably more times of discussion before we ultimately vote. To Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we certainly accompanying your grief. I know you and I visited just a little bit at the funeral yesterday in Houston. Please know that you have my heartfelt condolences. You know, I have 5 brothers. You know, sometimes they beat up on me a little bit, and sometimes they were helpful, and sometimes they were just brothers. So I know how important that is, so I grieve with you. Mr. Chairman, I wish that we were here today under different circumstances. Instead, we're here because our nation is struggling to heal after witnessing the horrific murder of George Floyd. As a person of faith, I was taught at an early age that we are all children of God. George Floyd was not treated as a child of God during his final moments on this earth. Mr. Floyd, I stand with you and your family, and I stand with Black and brown Americans and all Americans across the country who just want to live and breathe without fear. I stand with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus as we demand for America to live up to its values. We can no longer continue living in America that says during the Pledge of Allegiance, justice for all, but then not actually guarantee justice for all. We must put an end to police brutality, racial profiling, white supremacy, and racism in America. We are here today because our laws must boldly affirm that Black lives matter. I want to get to the topic of the case itself, the investigation, and what may or may not happen, because I think that the Justice and Policing Act addresses a lot of the issues that I've seen as a lawyer, a former judge, when some of these cases are handled. I also might add that I served as the first chair of the Police Independent Oversight Board in Houston. I helped Mayor Parker put that together, and then she made me chair for 2 years. So I've seen some of these cases, and some of them are tough to make. And in your case, Mr. Floyd, I think that it was good that there was swift action. The police officer was arrested. It took a little time before they arrested the others. But in many cases, the Arbery case, he was out jogging 74 days before an arrest. And just recently we saw in the video that was just released in Williamson County, an incident that happened in March of 2019. The arrest was actually delayed, and the video was even more delayed. They just released it last week, although it happened in March of 2019, a year later. So sometimes it's not quick enough, and then we wonder why. So I wanted to ask first Ms. Eiffel, if she's still on us with us by video. In terms of investigations, are we adequately addressing the need for an independent investigation in the Justice and Policing Act?
Yes, this is one of the most important parts of the legislation. It is critical that communities feel that these killings and these abuses are investigated by someone who is independent, who is not connected with the local prosecutor's office, and who can bring fresh eyes to bear on whether there was a violation of the Constitution or a violation of criminal law. And in too many places around the country, we have seen these incidents where prosecutors have demonstrated that they are unwilling to robustly lean into an investigation, unwilling to arrest, unwilling to indict, or if they bring the case before the grand jury, we then hear later that the presentation was lackluster and was not the kind of presentation we would expect of a prosecutor. So we need independence.
I want to move quickly if we can.
A colossal lack of confidence right now in the justice system, and it is deserved. And as a lawyer, I can say it pains me because I have dedicated my life as a civil rights lawyer to using the law to effect change. But what you are seeing on the streets of this country, all over this country, is a colossal lack of confidence in the justice system. And it is incumbent upon this body in this legislation to put together the means of restoring that confidence. And that confidence only comes back if the justice system can be said to be fair, can be said to be legitimate, and can be said to produce just results. And when it comes to cases of police killing unarmed African Americans, at this point, we do not have those three.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I did have a question for Mr. Crump and Ms. Gupta, but I'll submit them in writing. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Cmgus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, members of the committee, and my fellow members of the Congressional Black Caucus for your leadership on this issue. I want to express my deepest condolences to you, Mr. Floyd, and to Ms. Underwood Jacobs as well. I know all of us will continue to keep you and your families in our prayers. What happened to your brother, Mr. Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor is truly an outrage. And I pray that together we can meet the moment and we can honor their memories by passing the Justice in Policing Act. And not just honor their memories, but the memories of so many others across the country. In 2016, here in Colorado, Michael Marshall, a 50-year-old, 112-pound black man, was killed by jail deputies. While enduring a psychiatric episode in jail, he was restrained in the prone position by 5 deputies for over 13 minutes, at which time he aspirated on his own vomit and went in and out of consciousness. And more recently, in August of 2019, Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old unarmed black man, died after a physical encounter with the Aurora Police Department while walking home one night. After initially not responding to police, McClain was tackled to the ground by officers, placed in a chokehold, and vomited. He was later given ketamine, suffered a heart attack on the way to the hospital, and ultimately died. And on the body camera recording, you can clearly hear Elijah say, "I can't breathe." These are the same words that we heard Eric Garner say over 6 years ago as he was put in a chokehold by an NYPD officer. They are the same words spoken by Mr. Floyd, who had a knee to his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It is past time that Congress ban chokeholds and other harmful police tactics that have led to far too many deaths. And that is why the Justice in Policing Act is so important. And I will say that I'm very encouraged by the broad base of support this legislation has received, including from the American Psychological Association. And with unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask to submit their statement of support into the record.
That objection.
As you may know, or rather I know the chairman's well aware, but as many, as I'm sure are aware also, data on policing has been particularly deficient for quite some time. And as a result, it has hindered our understanding and our ability to hold law enforcement accountable in real time. We don't know this week how many times an officer used a taser or fired their weapon, or how many times individuals were injured while they were in police custody. This is basic information, and it's critical information to ensuring that such actions are regulated. And that brings me to my first question for Ms. Gupta, which is, how does the mostly volunteer system that we currently have on data collection fail to capture these data points? And second, how does requiring state and local law enforcement to report that data improve accountability?
Thank you, Congressman. It is a real shame that in 2020 we still do not have adequate data collection on use of force in this country. We've had to rely for several years on journalists to putting this stuff together at the Washington Post and at the Guardian. The FBI has started to try to more systematically collect it, but This bill, the Justice and Policing Act, actually includes a requirement for states to report use of force data to the Justice Department, including the reason that force was used. Technical assistance grants are established in this bill to assist agencies that have fewer than 100 employees with compliance. That was often the reason that police agencies were not reporting on this, but it also requires the Attorney General to collect data on traffic stops, searches, uses of deadly force by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, and to disaggregate that data by race, ethnicity, and gender. There should be no reason why in the United States of America in 2020 we aren't able to collect that kind of data, and these incentives are going to be really important to making sure that we have that data, can learn from it, and can improve and change the culture of policing from it as well.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta, and your testimony certainly underscores why the Justice and Policing Act is so necessary. Thank you again to each of our witnesses for being here today and for testifying. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of our witnesses that are still left. Thank you for being here for so long today. It's really vitally important that we hear from you. But most specifically, I want to say to you, Mr. Floyd, and also to Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I offer you my deepest condolences, because I know exactly how you feel. I know your pain. I can't sit here and say, I can only imagine. I know what you are going through. And Mr. Floyd, I was so grateful to be able to go to your brother's funeral in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I am so sorry that you are here testifying over the loss of your brother. We come to this hearing today as a result of deep, morally painful wounds and events that happen in this country again and again and again. We come to remember George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many lives that have been lost to violence at the hands of those with a sworn duty to protect and serve us. We have lost too many of our brothers and our sisters and our mothers and our fathers under these incidences of law enforcement. We know that these recent tragedies are part of a system of racial disparities that have been harming people of color for 400 years. In Georgia, where I represent Georgia's 6th Congressional District, we recently lost the life of Ahmaud Arbery, who was pursued by 3 men and chased by 2 pickup trucks and murdered in the streets just miles from his home. As Georgia investigators testified last week that Ahmaud's killer used the N-word as Ahmaud lay dying in the street. The investigator testified that the killer's father, a former police officer, carried a handgun during the pursuit, a handgun that was issued to him by his police department. A handgun that he carried as a police officer, still bearing the initials of the department. I grieve every day for these continued losses. I grieve as a mother who lost her own child to the very same violence that we're talking about today and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. I lost my son, Jordan, by a man who called him a thug for simply playing loud music in his car. Jordan's
tragedy is shockingly similar to Ahmaud Arbery's. Being black while being in your own community. I feel the pain experienced by too many families every single day, and every single day it happens. It's like a sucker punch in my heart and my gut. Because when is it going to stop? I pray every single day for our nation. I pray every single day for every family. And I pray that today we finally do something about it. I know that my time is going to be up, so I'm going to just ask one very quick question. Professor Butler, very briefly, do you think a commission that I have been working on, a commission that would study the social determinants and effects of young black men and boys in this country, do you believe that that would be justified in creating research and data for this very legislation that we're talking about today?
I think African American boys and girls desperately need interventions that don't blame them for problems that society causes. So I think that that kind of commission is key.
Thank you very, very much. And I know that my time is up, but I am begging everyone here today, I am begging you to stand in the gap. I am begging you to speak up. I am begging you to be a part of solving the problems of all the young black men and women in this country that die every single day, because if you do not, you are complicit. And now you'll back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for moving quickly to hold this necessary hearing during a time of significant pain for our nation. And I want to recognize and thank Congresswoman Bass for her leadership to heal that pain. The Justice in Policing Act is an essential first step. Mr. Floyd, I offer my deepest condolences to you and your family. I can't imagine how difficult the last 2 weeks have been, and it is courageous that you are here today. Just yesterday, you laid your brother to rest. But his murder is a tragic reminder that we cannot rest. We have work to do so that George Floyd and Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Antonio Arce, and too many others will not have died in vain, and that their lives spur us to action. It's been more than 400 years since enslaved Africans were first brought to America's shores, shackled, and sold. We are in the midst of a reckoning and facing a very difficult truth, that since that moment, there's not been a single day in which the maxim that our founders knew to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, has been fully recognized by our country for Black Americans. Not a single day in which equal justice under the law has been fully experienced by Black Americans. There is no greater tragedy in our history. And our generation has a choice. We can sustain America's original sin, or we can redeem her and be repairers of the breach. I recognize that the ability to end racism in our country is beyond the reach of this committee. We don't have the power to change every person's heart and mind. But what we can do is address structural racism and enact tangible measures of transparency and accountability in policing that can help make everyone safe. This is a charge that every level of government must take up, from those of us in Congress to everyone who serves on a city council. During my time as the mayor of my hometown, we started a community policing trust initiative, which earned the recognition from the Obama administration's Department of Justice. We enhanced de-escalation training for our officers. We rewrote the guidelines for interacting with our immigrant community. we started putting body-worn cameras on officers on patrol. And then when we saw the positive results, we budgeted for every officer on the beat to wear a camera. But I'll be the first to tell you, there is more work to do in every state, in every city, in every community in America. So I want to ask our distinguished panel specifically about body-worn cameras. In 2014, research by Arizona State University found that officers wearing body cameras were more aware of their actions and sensitive to the scrutiny of the footage by their superiors. And I believe that every police officer on patrol in America ought to be wearing a body-worn camera. Professor Butler, do you believe that body-worn cameras help make members of the public and the police officers safer?
Absolutely. Without body-worn cameras, there would be 4 killer cops who remained on the police force of Minneapolis.
President Davis, how can body-worn cameras improve training for police officers?
Thank you for the question. In addition to capturing what happens, it allows the police department to go back and look at the everyday encounter, car stops, traffic stops, pedestrian stops, and evaluate the conduct. There's a good study out of Oakland, what Stanford did, to show that how officers engage men and women of color is completely different than how they were engaging non-minorities. So there's a lot to be learned just by watching the day-to-day activities, in addition to capturing the critical incidents that we're talking about.
Thank you. Ms. Eiffel, one of the main challenges with body-worn cameras is that they can be expensive to implement, not just the camera itself, but capturing all the information that they can provide. In your view, are they a wise and worthwhile investment for law enforcement agencies?
I think body-worn cameras are vitally important, and I would caution that it is necessary to do more than just impose body-worn cameras. And that means there does need to be attention to the laws that govern who gets to look at that film. In jurisdictions where law enforcement officers get to look at the film before they have to answer questions, then the body-worn camera film is just another tool that assists law enforcement officers in impunity. I think we also have to pay attention to jurisdictions that are embedding facial recognition technology in their body-worn cameras. This presents a very serious privacy concern for communities, and particularly African-American communities. So they're important. They're not the be-all and end-all, because we've seen film. We saw film with Eric Garner. We saw film with Walter Scott, the officer who killed Walter Scott, who was originally acquitted, or the jury was hung. We know that film is not the be-all and end-all, but it is vital for all of the reasons that have been suggested. And I do want to flag, however, those cautions about what happens with that film is also a question that I would encourage you all to think about answering on the front end.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, and thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for bringing us together and for bringing forward this powerful piece of legislation at a time when our country desperately needs it. I thank all of our witnesses today. I pray that our words and our actions will be worthy of this moment. If anybody has a doubt as to systemic racism in this country, as to inequality based on race in this country, you can look no further than between me and my friend and colleague, Ms. McBath. I'm the mother of 3 white sons. I've never had to have the talk. You were the mother of beautiful Jordan Davis. You had to have the talk. If you doubt there is racism, look no further than the inequality of our life experience. And I mourn with you. My sincere sympathy to Ms. Underwood Jacobs and her family for the loss of her brother. And Mr. Floyd, it is heartbreaking, it is soul-crushing what we witnessed 2.5 weeks ago as the depraved murder of your brother. My sympathy is with you, but more my words and my actions will be with you. The world is watching. Ms. Gupta, I'd like to talk first about the issue of the National Registry. There's been some conversation about it. And I remember the horror of Tamir Rice's murder in 2014, the anger that we all felt, the dismay of a police officer who killed a beautiful little boy. That police officer had been deemed and emotionally unstable and unfit for duty by the police department he had worked at before joining the Cleveland Police. He never disclosed that information in his application. The Cleveland Police never reviewed his previous personnel file before hiring him. We must expect agents of government entrusted with the awesome responsibility of protecting and serving, but also capable of using brutal and deadly force, to be hired under rigorous standards. Do we know how pervasive this problem is of not knowing the background of police officers as they are hired?
There are some registries that associations, regional associations have created, but there is no national registry of this sort that is being proposed in this really important legislation. This is why it is high time that this provision in the Justice and Policing Act be passed. It's time to have a national registry that has this kind of information that could save lives and frankly also promote community trust. But this national registry would have misconduct complaints, it would have discipline termination records, it would have records of certification. It contains conditioning for money, for funds, so that agencies actually have to put in inputs before they can access federal money. But it is high time for this to happen.
I was talking this week with my own Attorney General, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, about the issue of a national registry. He too supports that, but I do know that he has also, as Attorney General, worked with and announced that he wishes to establish and have the legislature in Pennsylvania establish a state registry. I think it's important that my home state is considering that. Should the tracking of disciplinary and performance records of law enforcement be left to the states alone? Is that sufficient, or does it mean that we should do both?
If you just have a patchwork of states that do this, then it's good that states are standing up, because right now is a moment where people are demanding change, and so states are beginning to take action. But you will end up with a patchwork that will not be sufficient to actually achieve the bottom line goal of having a registry that would be national, that people move around. They look at jobs in other jurisdictions. And so it isn't enough to have this patchwork. It's time for Congress to act and to create a national kind of rubric for this.
Absolutely. And Mr. Floyd, I'd like to end with you to thank you for your strength for being here today. We can't imagine the exhaustion, the fatigue, the grief. But we are here with you, and the world supports you. I hope that offers you some consolation. And your brother will be remembered worldwide for a very, very, very long time to come. As your niece and his daughter said, my daddy changed the world, and he has, and I'm confident he will. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us not about his death, but about his life. What did you know and love about your big brother? What should we know about his life?
He was a role model for me and a lot of guys coming out the neighborhood, because he was the first one to get a scholarship. We all wanted scholarships, and he was the first one because it was just hard. You had to get either academic scholarship or you could get one playing sports. But he had got him a scholarship, and it made everybody else feel like they can get one too.
He was a talented athlete.
Yes, ma'am.
I think he was a coach to people, wasn't he?
Yes, ma'am. He was a coach. It's just so much about him. Talking with Cyril, I don't know if y'all know him, but anyway, he talked to a lot of kids. He went to a lot of different places, met a lot of people. He went to China, played with Yao Ming, against Yao Ming. He did a lot of different things, and he come back and he shared information with us, and it was excited to see him every time, because he showed us so much, just a big gentle giant. And he took us to a lot of places. We went to Orlando, went down there and watched basketball games. He had a lot of friends as athletes, and we just vibed, and he showed us that there's other places in life besides being in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Floyd. I see my time has expired.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start my 5 minutes with a video that I came across, and it really struck a chord. This happened in Miami. The women in the video were worried. They had been threatened by a neighbor who had a shotgun and was making racist slurs. They called 911 for safety and for protection. Instead, they were met with force.
I have to be corrected when my life was just threatened and my daughter's sick. I just want to go
Are you going to put your
No, please stop. She didn't even do nothing. Touch me. Do not touch me. Do not touch me. What the heck? I am. What the? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Do not touch me. She's not doing nothing. I wanted to call my kids. I just said I wanted to call my kids. My phone is dead. What do you not understand? I got a gun pointed in front of me, and my kids is sick. I'm stressed out. I need to go. Call my children.
Conduct like this is never acceptable. The woman was unarmed. She called 911 because she felt threatened. She called 911 hoping that police officers would come to protect her. And instead, you saw those images. The officer in this video later lied about what happened on the police report and is now facing charges of misconduct and battery. Let me tell you, this happened only 2 months ago. There was no reason to subject someone to excessive force because of the color of their skin. And the reality is that people of color live and face these prejudices throughout their entire lives. They face discrimination. It's ingrained in our culture since the very founding of our country. And we have to confront this crisis head on. Currently, right now, there is absolutely no national standard to require police officers to de-escalate and avoid the use of excessive force. We have to eliminate the injustices that Black men and women and communities of color face everywhere, in our government, in our society, in our healthcare system, and specifically in the police systems that we have seen for decades. I can also tell you that from my own personal experience, this is not representative of every police officer. I have very close relationships with law enforcement in Miami. Officer Tooks, McCombie, Officer Demps, they are part of the community. They have earned the trust of the community. But we have to start by accepting that there is racial bias in our police system. We have to accept that. I continue to hear from members of this administration that there's no racism, that there's no racial bias. And that is not true. Racism is systemic, and we have to hold our police departments accountable and demand transparency. To do that, we have to engage with the community through civilian oversight. Civilian oversight boards build bridges between police and communities by giving the people a voice in the policies that affect them. They ensure officer accountability through fair and open investigation, and over time they build trust. Civilian oversight has to be done correctly, however. They have to be independent, they have to have subpoena power, they must have the authority to conduct investigations into police misconduct, and most importantly, civilian oversight boards have to represent the diversity in the community. Its seats need to be filled not by political appointees, but with local citizens and the leaders of local organizations focused on community policing and accountability. So I'm proud that the Justice and Policing Act promotes civilian oversight and allows federal funding to go toward building civilian review boards. So my first question is to Mr. Ron Davis. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your testimony the need for police to collaborate with the community to redefine and reimagine policing. And that includes a new system that fosters civilian oversight. Can you please explain why civilian oversight is an important factor in preventing police brutality and is effective in holding police accountable?
Yes, Congresswoman, and thank you for the call. I'll refer back to, I think as one of your colleagues mentioned, Sir Robert Peel, the 10 principles, or something called the 9 principles of law enforcement. And one of them says that police only police or use their authority with the consent of people. And the best way to have the consent is you need the checks and balances to make sure that those, our police officers, myself included when I was serving, to have such enormous and awesome power, the power to take freedom, the power to take life, are held accountable with a check and balance system so that there is trust, that there's legitimacy, and that there's accountability. So civilian oversight provides that extra layer, the same way we want independent prosecutors, independent citizens. To have an independent civilian oversight is some balance so that the awesome power that the police are given by the community is accountable. We're accountable for that, and that we then police with the consent of the people, and that's the only way we can be effective. So there are varying models with it, but I think in general, the core principle of civilian oversight does go towards community policing. It makes the police and the community who produces the public safety, both responsible, both being accountable, and it's the best form of oversight that you can have.
Thank you, Mr. Davis and Mr. Floyd. Thank you so much for joining us today. Losing someone in a violent manner and having footage of that has to be the most devastating way of losing someone. So I share with all my colleagues here today my deepest condolences to you and the family, and we're here for anything that you need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses who have appeared today. I too extend my condolences to Ms. Underwood Jacobs on the loss of her brother, and to you, Mr. Floyd, on the loss of your brother, and we'll continue to keep you and your family in my thoughts and prayers. I hope you recognize, Mr. Floyd, that the brutal murder of your brother has awakened the conscience of this country. And it has resulted in people all across America raising their voices and demanding an end to racial injustice, an end to police brutality, particularly against Black Americans and other communities of color, and for the creation of a safe, effective policing model for every single person in this country that will improve public safety and also the safety and effectiveness of police work. The tragedy is these are not new problems that we're experiencing. Your brother's death is only the most recent example of ugly racism and police brutality that have been a stain on the soul of this nation since our founding. I think everyone in this hearing brings their own experiences. And so before I was in politics, I was a civil rights lawyer. Most of my cases were police brutality cases. And so many of the hurdles that I faced in bringing those cases and seeking justice are addressed in the Justice and Policing Act. I then became mayor of the city of Providence and inherited a police department that was under a patterns of practice investigation by the Department of Justice. A police department that was really at war with the community. Crime was on the increase and the public had lost confidence in that community. And one of the things that was so effective in turning around that was the participation of the community, working in partnership with the police. We produced the lowest crime rate in 40 years. We became a fully accredited police department, and the police officers became integrated into the communities they served. And so one of the things that I'm really concerned about is during the Trump administration has changed the policies about these patterns and practice investigations. It was one of the things that we were able to use to force change that the chief and the department and I as the mayor wanted. Under the Obama administration, the Justice Department opened 25 investigations into police departments, signed and enforced over a dozen consent decrees in places as diverse as Ferguson to honor the life and
back to Wednesday, June 10th.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the following materials concerning the Justice and Policing Act and related issues, which have been submitted to the committee's electronic repository, will be included in the record. A number of leading civil rights organizations, statements by the Fraternal Order of Police, the Constitutional Accountability Center, the Players Coalition, the YWCA, Adobe, Third Way, the National Partnership for Women and Families, the Blue Dog Coalition, and articles in Reuters and Boston Globe will be admitted into the record without objection. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing, in particular Mr. Floyd, with whom we have the greatest sympathy and thanks. That concludes today's hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Aaron? Aaron, we just connected everything here today. Tomorrow morning we're gonna fix it. We just connected everything as a power. And tomorrow we're gonna clean up. Tomorrow's the CBC.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day, we're taking